about. But before we look to the future, I do want to talk about a news story that the Trump administration has been receiving scrutiny over, and that is those controversial boat strikes in the Pacific and Caribbean. And since September, the United States military has struck over 25 vessels, and these attacks have killed over 90 people so far. And the Trump administration has said that these strikes are part of a campaign against drug trafficking, and everyone that has been killed in these attacks that are on those boats are narco-terrorists. Others are questioning the legality of these strikes, and some are even questioning if these were war crimes or if one of the strikes in particular, that double tap strike at least, was a war crime. What do the American people think about these boat strikes?
Yeah, and first, we just wanted to know and establish how many folks were actually paying attention to these boat strikes, whether this had really broken through with the public, and we found that a majority.
Did you hear that? Did you hear the casual horror just recited so matter-of-factly that you could almost miss it amid the sterile polling data? Over 95 people killed and more than 25 strikes on vessels since September, and we're sitting here discussing public opinion on this butchery, like we're rating a television show, like we're choosing between competing brands of breakfast cereal. And I need you to understand the sheer obscenity of what's happening right now, because this is the moment where American exceptionalism meets its most grotesque incarnation, where the rhetoric of the war on drugs collides with the reality of extrajudicial execution, where a September strike involved not just one attack but a double-tap strike killing 2 shipwrecked survivors after the initial assault. And if your blood isn't boiling yet, then you haven't been paying attention, because we are witnessing state-sanctioned murder, dressed up in the language of national security theater. The polling numbers they just cited reveal something even more chilling than the body count itself. A nation so fractured along partisan lines that we can't even agree on whether killing people in international waters without trial constitutes a crime against humanity. And here's where I need you to stay with me, because the story gets worse, so much worse. The Washington Post reported that the September 2 strike left 2 survivors, but a second attack was carried out to comply with what officials described as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's directive to kill everybody on board. Representative Jim Himes told reporters what he saw in classified footage was one of the most troubling things in his time in public service, describing 2 individuals in clear distress without means of locomotion with a destroyed vessel who were killed by the United States, which is precisely the kind of double-tap strike tactic that has been called a potential war crime by experts who compared it to prosecuted Nazi military leaders at Nuremberg. Let me be absolutely clear about what international law says about this, because the legal architecture matters desperately when we're talking about the difference between warfare and murder. Human Rights Watch explicitly states there is no armed conflict in the Caribbean between the United States and any drug trafficking organization, and so there is no group who are legitimate military targets, meaning U.S. obligations are elaborated under international human rights law, which governs lethal force outside armed conflict. And UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk called on the U.S. to halt strikes to prevent extrajudicial killing, and his office stated airstrikes violate international human rights law, adding the strikes were taking place outside the context of armed conflict or active hostility, contradicting Trump's manufactured armed conflict declaration entirely. But wait, there's more bombshell after bombshell, because the Trump administration's justification for this killing spree rests on the flimsiest possible legal ground. Trump formally notified Congress on October 1 that the U.S. was in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants regarding drug cartels, essentially inventing a war out of thin air to circumvent the constitutional requirement for congressional authorization. Legal experts roundly reject the administration's claim that drug trafficking constitutes an attack on the U.S., and that alleged traffickers are unlawful combatants who can be killed with military force, yet the Senate has twice blocked bipartisan efforts to restrain this madness. The current polling reveals Trump's approval rating has fallen to 36% according to Gallup, the lowest of his second term, and just 36% of Americans approve of his handling of the economy according to NPR polling, with his overall job approval at a meager 38%, the lowest of his second term and the lowest since April 2018. Yet here we are watching him prosecute an illegal military campaign that experts, human rights groups, and international bodies say is illegal under U.S. and international law, with Colombian and Venezuelan governments accusing the U.S. of extrajudicial murder, and the partisan breakdown on these boat strikes exposes the moral bankruptcy at the heart of contemporary American conservatism, because Republicans overwhelmingly support summary execution in international waters, as long as their strongman president orders it. Now let's talk about what's really happening here beneath the surface, because this isn't actually about drug trafficking at all. According to the Washington Office on Latin America, and UN Office on Drugs and Crime, about 90% of U.S.-bound cocaine transits the Eastern Pacific and Western Caribbean, not near Venezuela's coast, and the DEA reported fentanyl entering the U.S. is produced in Mexico, using precursor chemicals from China, not Venezuela, which means Trump is bombing boats in the wrong damn ocean if he actually cared about stopping drugs. Venezuelan opposition figures, Trump administration sources, and independent political analysts have suggested the U.S.'s true motive is to remove Maduro, making this an illegal regime change operation disguised as counter-narcotics enforcement. The evidence that these are extrajudicial killings rather than legitimate military operations becomes overwhelming when you examine what we know, and critically what we don't know. The administration has not publicly released evidence that boats were actually carrying drugs and who was on board, and Colombian President Gustavo Petro said one strike killed a fisherman, not a drug cartel member, prompting Trump to call Petro an illegal drug leader and cut funds to Colombia, which is exactly what authoritarian regimes do when their war crimes get exposed. They attack the messenger and double down on the violence. But here's where the horror escalates into genuine constitutional crisis territory. Trump told reporters land strikes are imminent, saying now we're starting by land, and that's going to start happening. And when asked if limited to Venezuela, Trump said it doesn't necessarily have to be in Venezuela, with the White House not responding to requests for clarification if attacks would occur in the United States. The commander of U.S. Northern Command said he is willing to conduct attacks on designated terrorist organizations within the U.S. after months of extrajudicial killings. Experts and lawmakers say are outright murders. We need to understand the legal mechanism Trump is exploiting here, because it's the blueprint for domestic authoritarianism. Senator Tammy Duckworth explained the administration justifies boat strikes by arbitrarily declaring suspected drug traffickers as part of designated terrorist organizations, which is not grounded in U.S. statute nor international law, but solely in what Trump says. And Duckworth said it's not a stretch to imagine Trump placing terrorist designations on U.S. citizens, which would open opportunity to carry out lethal strikes against them, asking if Trump is using this justification without verified evidence or legal authorization. What's stopping him from designating anyone within our borders and conducting lethal militarized attacks, which is precisely the nightmare scenario that civil liberties organizations warned about when Trump issued executive orders targeting progressive groups. The double-tap strike that started this controversy deserves special attention because it represents a profound violation of the laws of war, even if we accept Trump's fraudulent armed conflict premise. The first strike on September 2 destroyed one vessel and killed 9 people, with 2 survivors left clinging to debris, but the Washington Post reported Mission Commander Admiral Frank Bradley authorized a second strike, killing the survivors after receiving a verbal directive from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, characterized as the order was to kill everybody. And the 1949 Geneva Conventions prohibit targeting medics, anyone assisting rescue efforts, or those wounded in a first strike, with experts saying a double-tap strike in lieu of rescuing unthreatening boat survivors is a war crime prosecuted at Nuremberg trials and violates the War Crimes Act of 1996. Let me make the legal stakes crystal clear, because this matters for everyone who cares about the rule of law. Legal experts say killing people while shipwrecked while they're hors de combat out of the fight is a war crime, but since the U.S. is not legally engaged in armed conflict with narco-terrorists, it's extrajudicial killing, which is murder under international law and domestic law. And Senator Angus King said if the strike was intended to kill survivors, that's a stone-cold war crime, and also murder. Yet Trump's approval among Republicans remains above 80%, because conservative voters have been conditioned to embrace strongman brutality as strength. The administration's refusal to provide transparency reveals consciousness of guilt. The ACLU and other groups filed lawsuits seeking release of Office of Legal Counsel opinion that apparently blesses ongoing strikes as lawful acts in alleged armed conflict with unspecified drug cartels, and our agencies have not responded to Freedom of Information Act requests within statutory guidelines. Because of course they haven't released the legal memo that supposedly authorizes this killing spree, they know it won't survive scrutiny because The Guardian reported the administration follows an Office of Legal Counsel memo fiercely criticized by outside legal experts, saying it's permissible to use lethal force against unflagged vessels carrying cocaine, since cartels use proceeds to fund violence, which is such an insane expansion of executive power, it would authorize killing anyone anywhere who profits from crime. And now the truly terrifying part, because we're watching the normalization of extrajudicial killing in real time. As of December 15, at least 95 people have been killed in 25 strikes on 26 vessels, with the number including one missing survivor presumed dead, and 2 others survived and were repatriated. Trump faces increasing scrutiny over the campaign, which has killed at least 95 people in 25 known strikes since early September, including a follow-up strike that killed 2 survivors clinging to wreckage. Yet these strikes continue almost weekly, with the administration posting videos on social media celebrating the explosions like their video game achievements. And new polling shows a majority of voters across nearly all demographics disagreeing with Trump's foreign policy strategy against Venezuela, with the military beginning airstrikes in September on alleged drug-carrying boats, as speculation persists whether the U.S. plans to militarily infiltrate Venezuela to remove Maduro, and Trump has alluded multiple times to potential land war with at least 90 people killed in more than 20 vessel strikes, the historical parallel to other American military adventures disguised as humanitarian intervention, should be screaming at us. Trump's continued targeting of foreign vessels in international waters, including bombings throughout the Caribbean and Pacific, that claimed at least 80 lives, suggests a broader motive to dictate economic policy of foreign governments in Latin America, particularly those with left-leaning leadership, because this is the 21st century version of gunboat diplomacy weaponized through drone technology and justified with the malleable language of counterterrorism. The New York Times revealed Navy SEALs massacred several unarmed North Korean fishermen during a 2019 Trump-authorized mission, while Trump pardoned former Honduran president convicted of facilitating importation of over 400 tons of cocaine into the United States, which exposes the performative nature of this entire drug war justification when Trump pardons actual narco-state leaders while bombing fishermen. The congressional response has been pathetically inadequate given the magnitude of constitutional violations we're witnessing. As of November 6, the U.S. Senate has twice rejected resolutions that would limit Trump's authority to continue military action, and Republicans have largely asserted the president is acting under Article 2 constitutional authority, and Senate Republicans have twice blocked bipartisan efforts aimed at preventing Trump from continuing military action without congressional approval, which means the Republican Party has completely abandoned any pretense of caring about separation of powers or congressional war authority when their guy is in the White House, revealing the utter hypocrisy of their Obama-era constitutional objections. What we're seeing in the polling about these strikes reveals the deeper sickness in American political culture, the fact that partisan identity has become so totalizing that Republicans will support literal war crimes if committed by a Republican president, while Democrats oppose them, not because of some consistent principled framework about international law and human rights, but because of tribal affiliation. And this is how democracies die, not with jackboots and midnight arrests initially, but with the slow normalization of extrajudicial killing, with the gradual acceptance that our side's strongman can murder with impunity, as long as the victims are foreign and brown, and allegedly criminal. The escalation from maritime strikes to potential land operations should terrify anyone paying attention, because Trump told Northcom chief and hundreds of generals and admirals that the United States was involved in a war from within, and that a major part would be played by some people in this room, and Trump told military leaders to view domestic deployments as training grounds for our military, and described America as waging a war from within, saying America is under invasion from within, no different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult because they don't wear uniform, which is the language of authoritarian regimes preparing to turn military force against domestic political opponents. And Trump's September executive order instructed his administration to target U.S. progressive groups and donors, as well as political activists who profess anti-American, anti-fascist, or anti-Christian sentiments. This is the architecture of fascism being constructed in real time, the designation of political opponents as terrorists subject to military force without judicial process, and the boat strikes in the Caribbean are the testing ground for legal theories that will eventually be applied domestically, if intelligence shared by cooperating governments is used by U.S. military to help identify strike targets. These governments may be complicit in extrajudicial killings, and the questionable legal justification for these attacks makes the Northcom commander's willingness to strike designated terrorist organizations domestically all the more concerning, according to the Brennan Center's senior director. The fact that Trump's overall approval has cratered to historic lows provides some hope that the American people aren't completely buying what he's selling. Emerson polling shows 41% approve and 50% disapprove of Trump's job performance, meaning he will end 2025 with a net approval rating of -9 percentage points. But the reality remains that Trump retains robust support from Republicans, with 84% approving of his job performance, which means the Republican base has been so thoroughly propagandized, they will support extrajudicial killing, war crimes, and potential domestic military deployment against political opponents, as long as Trump is the one ordering it. We're at an inflection point in American history where the choice couldn't be starker: Either we demand accountability for these illegal strikes and construct legal barriers preventing their recurrence, or we accept that American presidents can designate anyone anywhere as a terrorist and kill them without trial, evidence, or judicial review. And if you think that power won't eventually be turned inward against Americans, you haven't been reading the last century of authoritarian history, because The Intercept noted the U.S. government has been killing people, including American citizens, around the world with drone strikes for the past 2 decades. And the boat strike campaign represents a significant expansion from targeting alleged terrorists in war zones to targeting alleged criminals in international waters, engaged in what is fundamentally law enforcement activity. The Human Rights Watch analysis cuts through all the administration propaganda with surgical precision. The United States is carrying out a campaign of extrajudicial killings with deliberately lethal strikes without credible legal basis, claiming boats carry narco-traffickers belonging to designated terrorist organizations. But the government has neither identified people killed nor demonstrated those killed were doing anything that could justify lethal force. And HRW recommends the U.S. immediately halt lethal strikes, disclose legal basis, identify every person killed, and notify families with reparations, release criteria for target selection, and prosecute those responsible for extrajudicial killing, which is what a nation committed to the rule of law and human rights would do. But we're not that nation anymore under Trump's authoritarian restoration. The comparison to historical American military adventurism in Latin America is unavoidable and damning. What we've seen suggests U.S. armed forces did something never done in more than 35 years of military involvement in drug interdiction in the Caribbean, an instant escalation to disproportionate lethal force against civilian vessels without apparent self-defense justification, and that using lethal force on suspicion of illegal activity violates more than a century of international standards and U.S. regulations for maritime operations, including UN Convention on Law of the Sea, Article 51 of UN Charter, San Remo Manual, Defense Department Law of War Manual, and Standing Rules of Engagement, all calling for restraint and proportionate escalation to avoid exactly this outcome. What happens next will define whether American democracy survives this authoritarian moment, because the boat strikes are simultaneously test case and preview for Trump's broader agenda to militarize domestic law enforcement and target political opponents. The public opinion polling, showing partisan division, reveals that roughly half the country has been so thoroughly captured by right-wing propaganda, they will support war crimes and extrajudicial killing, which means the fight for accountability and the rule of law will be waged against not just Trump's administration, but against the tens of millions of Americans who've embraced authoritarian governance, as long as it targets the right enemies. We stand at the precipice watching an American president claim the authority to kill anyone anywhere he designates as a terrorist without judicial process, congressional authorization, or international legal justification, prosecuting an illegal military campaign that has already killed nearly 100 people and threatens to expand to land operations, potentially including domestic targets. And the only thing standing between this authoritarian power grab and the complete collapse of constitutional governance is organized resistance from civil society, from Congress members willing to prioritize rule of law over partisan loyalty, from international pressure exposing American hypocrisy, and from the American people finally waking up to realize that extrajudicial killing normalized abroad will inevitably come home, because that's what empire does. It teaches brutality in the periphery, then imports those techniques to the center. And if we don't stop these illegal boat strikes now, if we don't demand accountability for the double-tap war crime that killed shipwrecked survivors clinging to wreckage, if we don't force transparency and congressional authorization and judicial review, then we're accepting that American presidents are above the law, that they can murder with impunity, and that the only question remaining is when they'll turn that power against us.